The bullet found her in the middle of a waltz. She was not dancing. She had been standing at the edge of the gallery, watching, as she always watched, as she had always been required to watch, when the crack split the air like a fault line opening in something that had been holding too long under too much pressure. One moment she was upright. The next, the world tilted sideways into warmth and noise and a pain so sharp it erased everything else. She did not expect arms to catch her. She did not expect his arms. She had spent 11 months being invisible to ballrooms, to drawing rooms, to the whole glittering machinery of a world that looked through women like her as though they were made of window glass, useful for the light they let in, never remarkable in themselves. She had become very good at the invisibility. She had made it a skill, then a discipline, then something so habitual she had nearly forgotten she was doing it. He had been watching her for 11 months. She had known it and refused to know it simultaneously. The way you refuse to know that the candle you're reading by is almost gone. If you don't look directly at it, you can pretend there's still time. There was still time. And then there wasn't. And she was falling. And the man they called the Ghost of Sevastopol, the man who had walked through enemy fire twice to bring his soldiers home, who had survived 3 wars without flinching, who had not been seen to show feeling of any kind in public in 12 years, was on his knees on the gallery floor with her in his arms, his face the color of chalk, his hands shaking for the first time in living memory, saying words he had spent 11 months refusing to say. This is not a story about a bullet. This is a story about a woman who had forgotten she could be seen, and the man who had never once stopped looking. The Ashby household smelled of beeswax, dried lavender, and the particular quiet desperation that accumulates when a family has more name than money and more pride than sense about the difference. Cecily Ashby had been managing that smell for 6 years. She was 27 years old. The eldest daughter of the late Sir Edmund Ashby, a man of considerable charm and catastrophic financial judgment, who had died owing debts to half of Mayfair, and what he had left his daughters was a townhouse in Belgravia they could not afford to heat, 2 younger sisters who needed marrying, and a surname that still opened doors, even if it could no longer pay for what was behind them. Cecily managed everything. She managed the household accounts with the precision of a general mapping a campaign on uncertain terrain. She negotiated with tradesmen who had learned her face well enough to know that the pleasant expression she maintained throughout their discussions was not softness, but strategy. She stretched weekly allowances across their requirements the way a tailor stretches fabric across a pattern, with no waste and no visible seams. She rose at 6, went to bed at midnight, and in between she made herself useful, indispensable, and as invisible as the furniture to everyone who relied on her, because the surest way to remain necessary was to make the necessity look effortless. She did not resent it, or she had taught herself very thoroughly not to resent it. There was a distinction, and she was precise enough to know it was there, and disciplined enough not to examine it closely. On the morning that changed everything, she was in the study, reconciling the household ledger with the focused attention most women in her position reserved for prayer, when her younger sister Harriet arrived through the door without knocking, without apologizing for not knocking, and without any of the contextual preamble that would have allowed Cecily to prepare herself. "He's arrived," Harriet announced. Her dark curls had escaped their pins in 3 separate places, which was standard for Harriet by 9 in the morning. Cecily did not look up from the column she was reconciling. "Who has arrived?" "Him, Major Gideon Ashby." Cecily's pen stopped. "He is not an Ashby," she said with care. "He is, distantly, cousin to Papa's cousin or some arrangement of that kind. It doesn't signify. What signifies is that he has taken the house on Grosvenor Square. The entire house. And Mrs. Partridge at the lending library says he has a man of business, 2 personal servants, a Crimea medal he doesn't wear, and a reputation that would make your hair stand on end. Harriet dropped into the chair across from her with the boneless ease of a young woman who has never once concerned herself with the impression created by her posture. They say he didn't speak for 6 months after he came home, not one word. Just sat in his estate in Derbyshire and sat. People say a great many things. They also say he's the one who held the line at Balaclava when the commanders had already written the position off as lost. That he went back through enemy fire twice, Cecily, to bring his men home. That they call him the Ghost of Sevastopol because no one can understand how he's still alive. Harriet leaned forward. And they say he is coming to the Pemberton Musicale on Thursday. Cecily returned to her ledger. That is entirely irrelevant to us, she said. She believed it when she said it. She would remember that later, that she had believed it completely, and that this had not protected her at all. The Pemberton house on Thursday evening was, as it always was, somewhere between a concert and a marriage market, with the music serving as the thinnest possible pretense for the latter. Cecily arrived with her sisters, Harriet in gloves borrowed from a neighbor, and the youngest, Clara, who was 17 and frightened of almost everything except horses and mathematics, and immediately began her private assessment of the room. Who needed to be greeted? Who needed to be avoided? Which eligible gentlemen were present, and whether any possessed both the income and the temperament for Harriet, who was lovely but required a man with patience and a strong sense of the absurd. She was in the middle of this calculation when the room shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no parting of the crowd, no shaft of light from a convenient window. He simply walked in, and the quality of the air in the room changed in the way it changes when a storm is still miles away, but the pressure has already begun to drop, and every animal in the field has already turned to face the direction it's coming from. Major Gideon Ashby was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came not from leisure or fashion, but from years of hard necessity. The frame of a man whose body had been required to perform reliably under conditions that would have destroyed other bodies, and had. His dark hair was cut close. His face was all planes and angles, weathered past its years, with a jaw set in the permanent, considered expression of a man who has learned that the majority of situations require less speech than people assume, and who has adjusted his output accordingly. He was not handsome in the Mayfair sense, polished, presented, pleasantly conscious of effect. He was handsome the way a cliff face is handsome, impressive, impersonal, carrying the implicit suggestion that proximity without care could be dangerous. His eyes, moving across the room with the unhurried assessment of a man accustomed to reading terrain, were the particular gray of a winter sky in the hour before the snow finally decides to fall. They passed over Cecily without stopping. She told herself this was entirely appropriate and returned to her assessment of eligible gentlemen. Lord Pemberton made the introductions. From across the room, Cecily watched as various members of the assembly attempted conversation with the major and received, in return, responses so economical they barely constituted sentences. Lady Pemberton laughed too brightly at something he hadn't said. The young man beside Harriet whispered something that made Harriet press her lips together. "He looks like he'd rather be anywhere else," Harriet observed, materializing at Cecily's elbow. "Most intelligent people do at these things. Are you calling yourself intelligent? I am calling us both trapped by social obligation, which is a different category." The musicale began. Cecily positioned herself in the second row, visible enough to satisfy propriety, far enough back to have a clear sightline to the door if the situation with the Hartley boy required management. She was entirely prepared for an evening of competent piano and strategic invisibility. She was not prepared for the Major to take the empty seat directly beside her. He sat without the elaborate social choreography of request and permission that governed every other interaction in these rooms. He simply sat, with the direct efficiency of a man who had identified a space that was available and needed it, and that was the entirety of the calculation. Cecily kept her eyes on the pianoforte. The music began. A young woman playing with technical proficiency and emotional absence, which was the most common combination Cecily encountered in her professional life. "She's rushing the third movement," said a low voice beside her. No preamble, simply the observation offered as fact. Cecily turned carefully. "She is. She does it every time. There's a fingering difficulty in bar 19 that she hasn't addressed, so she accelerates through it rather than solve the underlying problem." The gray eyes moved to her. Something in them shifted, not warmth, not yet anything she had a word for, but the specific quality of attention a person gives when they have encountered something they did not anticipate. "You play," he said. "I teach. There is a difference." A pause. The music continued rushing through its unsolved difficulties. "Cecily Ashby," he said. Not a greeting, an identification, precise and unhurried, as though placing her in a mental ledger. "Major Ashby," she returned. "Distantly related, I understand." "Distantly enough to be of no consequence." Is that a reassurance or a concern? A longer pause than the first. "I haven't decided," he said. The piece ended. Applause. Cecily turned forward again, aware in a way she had not been 4 minutes earlier of exactly how much space existed between her shoulder and his. Not enough space. She did not, at the time, examine why that was the first thing she noticed. 3 days after the Pemberton Musicale, a letter arrived at the Ashby townhouse. Cecily recognized the handwriting before she had read the salutation. She had an eye for hands. It was a professional necessity, and felt something tighten in her chest that she chose, deliberately, to interpret as wariness. "Miss Ashby, I find myself in need of a music instructor for my ward, Miss Annabel Crane, aged 11, who has been promised one and whose previous instructor has recently departed London for reasons I will not detail in correspondence. I am told you teach. My man of business will call tomorrow at 10 if this arrangement is agreeable. G. Ashby, Major, retired." She read it twice. She set it down on the desk with the careful deliberateness of a woman making a decision she has not yet consciously articulated to herself. The arrangement was not straightforward. Teaching was one matter. She had 4 pupils currently, and the income kept the household in coal through January. But teaching in his household? 3 mornings a week with all the proximity that entailed, and all the conversation it would generate in drawing rooms that had nothing better to discuss, and all the complicated questions about what a woman in her position owed to practicality versus propriety versus the specific and inconvenient fact that she had thought about that single conversation in the second row of the Pemberton Musicale more than twice. That was a different calculation entirely. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Major Ashby, the arrangement is agreeable. I will expect your man of business at 10. She told herself it was the money. The Hartley family had canceled without notice last month, and Clara needed boots before the cold arrived, and Harriet's gloves were borrowed and could not remain borrowed indefinitely. She told herself it was entirely, straightforwardly practical. She posted the letter before she could think more carefully about whether that was true. The house on Grosvenor Square was everything the Ashby townhouse was not. Large, warm, impeccably maintained, and carrying the atmosphere of a place that had been restored to order by someone with exacting standards and the resources to enforce them. The butler, A grave man named Stokes showed her to a music room on the second floor that contained a Broadwood grand of a quality that made Cecily's breath catch before she had time to compose herself. She was running her fingers along the keyboard, not playing, simply feeling the action, the weight and release of each key, the extraordinary evenness of it, when she heard footsteps. She turned, expecting the child. She found the Major. He was in civilian clothes, dark coat, gray waistcoat, no insignia, but he carried himself the way men who have spent years in uniform always carry themselves, as though gravity operates under different terms with them. He filled the doorway without effort or intention, simply by being the size he was. Miss Ashby. He looked at the piano, then at her hands, still resting on the keys.
You play. I told you, I teach. You were playing. I was evaluating the instrument.
She withdrew her hands and clasped them in front of her.
It's exceptional. Your ward is fortunate.
Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, not quite anything she had a name for yet. She doesn't think so. She finds the piano an imposition. Most children do. Until they don't. When does the change occur? When they find something they need to say that words cannot carry. She looked at him steadily. It's different for every child. The ones who never find it are the ones who stop playing the moment no one requires it of them. He was quiet for a moment, regarding her with that winter sky assessment she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things. Not rudely, but completely. The way a man looks at things when he has learned, in conditions where incomplete observation costs lives, that it is better to see everything than to be polite about not looking. My ward lost her parents 14 months ago, he said. Stated plainly as a fact transferred from one person's understanding to another's. No softness around the edges, no apology for the weight of it. Her father was my sergeant, the finest man I ever commanded. He died in the same engagement where I... A pause, brief, barely perceptible, like a step taken to the edge of something and then back. She has no other family. I am her guardian by his last request and my own. And the piano? Her mother played. Annabelle wants to learn. A pause that was almost, in another man, something like rueful. She also has opinions about the duration and timing of practice sessions that I am not equipped to negotiate. Are you asking me to be a music instructor or a diplomat? In my experience, he said, the positions are frequently the same. This time Cecily had to press her lips together. Annabelle Crane arrived 6 minutes later, small, brown-haired, wearing the expression of a child who has been disappointed enough times to stop expecting things to be good before they start. Preemptive hostility as self-protection. Cecily recognized it with the precision of someone who had employed a version of it herself. She sat down at the piano bench and patted the space beside her. "Come here," she said. "I want to show you something." Annabelle came, dragging her feet with the artistry of a prisoner being escorted to a sentence she didn't deserve. Cecily played a single chord, held it, let the resonance spread and fade. "What does that sound like?" she asked. Annabelle's eyes narrowed. "A chord? What does it feel like?" A pause. The preemptive hostility flickered, and beneath it, just briefly, something else surfaced. "Like Sunday morning, before anyone else wakes up?" "That's E-flat major. Every chord has a feeling. By the time we're finished, you'll be able to say things in music that you cannot say any other way." Cecily glanced sideways at the girl. "Things you might not want to say out loud." Annabelle looked at the piano keys with an expression that was not the same expression she had arrived with. From the doorway, the major watched both of them. He did not speak. He did not leave. He stood with his shoulder against the frame in the particular posture of a man who tells himself he is simply passing through and does not examine the fact that he has not moved in 12 minutes. Cecily did not look at him. She focused on the child and the keys and the Sunday morning feeling of E-flat major. She was very good, when she chose to be, at focusing on what was directly in front of her. The lessons became, in ways Cecily had not permitted herself to anticipate, the best hours of her week. Annabelle was not easy. She had perfect pitch and wielded it as a critical instrument rather than a creative one. She had the 11-year-old's preternatural genius for identifying the exact moment an adult's vigilance had relaxed and deploying it with surgical precision. She renegotiated the terms of practice duration approximately every 8 minutes in ways that were technically reasonable and collectively exhausting. But she was also brilliant and lonely in the bone-deep, carefully managed way of a child who has learned that the people she loves disappear without warning or logic, and who has therefore quite rationally decided not to love anything she cannot control or replace. Cecily recognized the mechanism. She had her own version of it. She taught around it the way a surgeon works around damaged tissue, carefully, obliquely, never pressing directly on the wound. She found out from Stokes, who turned out beneath his professional gravity to possess a prodigious memory for domestic detail and a quiet, steady sympathy for the child that expressed itself in small acts. Annabelle's preferred biscuits appearing at lesson time. The fire in the music room built a degree higher on damp days. That Annabelle's mother had hummed a particular folk melody from the north of England while working in the kitchen on cold mornings. Cecily learned it, transcribed it from the description Stokes gave her, filling in the gaps from her own ear. She introduced it on a Thursday in the 4th week, without explanation, framed simply as a northern melody worth knowing. Annabelle's hands stilled on the keys after the 3rd bar. She didn't speak. She was 11, and she had learned, the brutal way, not to cry at things. But her hands against the keys began to tremble, minutely, barely visible, the way a structure trembles before it decides whether to hold or give. Cecily did not offer comfort. She did not name what was happening. She understood from her own experience of loss that naming it sometimes made it worse, that what grief needed in its first moments was not acknowledgement, but company. She placed her own hand, very lightly, over Annabelle's, held it there for 3 seconds, then lifted it.
"From the beginning," she said, "slower this time."
Annabelle played it again, slower, better, all the way through. From the doorway came a sound that a man with less practiced self-control would not have made. A breath, taken carefully, through a throat that had unexpectedly tightened. Cecily did not look at him, but she was aware of him in the doorway the way you are aware of a source of warmth in a cold room, not by looking at it, but by the way the air on one side of you is different from the air on the other. She told herself this was incidental, architectural, a consequence of the room's dimensions. She was not convincing herself as thoroughly as she once had. The structure of the arrangement was clear, and she kept to it precisely. She arrived at 9, she departed by noon. She spoke to the major when he spoke to her and maintained the professional distance that the situation required and that her own good sense, which had until recently been entirely reliable, demanded. He was her employer. She was a music instructor from a family of reduced circumstances. The gap between them, in rank and social standing and the power dynamics that governed every interaction between men of his position and women of hers, was not a romantic obstacle in a story. It was a structural fact of the world they both inhabited. It had weight. It had consequence. It was not sentimentality, but simple accuracy to acknowledge it. She was entirely aware of all of this. She was also aware, with the precision of a woman who has spent years observing rooms from their margins, of how he moved through spaces, the particular quality of his attention when she said something that surprised him, a slight recalibration, the mental equivalent of a man adjusting his map to account for new terrain. The way his posture shifted differently when Annabelle was struggling versus when she was managing, a barely perceptible change in the radius of his attention, like a hand moved closer to something without touching it. The fact that he had read, she noticed one Tuesday, every book on the music room shelf, including the 3 volumes on musical theory she had brought from home and left on the side table, and then forgotten. She returned the following Thursday to find them rearranged. Not dramatically, simply organized differently, by period rather than by composer, which was, she had to admit, a more logical system than the one she had created. Inside the cover of the Clementi, a note. The arrangement by period made more sense to me than the previous one. If you preferred it as it was, I apologize. G.A. She stood in the music room holding that note for considerably longer than was reasonable. She did not rearrange the books. That evening at home, she sat in the Ashby drawing room after Harriet and Clara had gone to bed and looked at the fire for a long time without reading anything, which was not a habit she had previously had. She filed this under Things Not to Think About directly. The file was getting full. The books continued. Not on a schedule she could predict, that was the particular quality of the thing, that it followed no pattern she could systematize or manage. Simply, periodically, a volume would appear. A collection of Johnson's essays left on the piano bench before her arrival. A book of Turner's landscape sketches slipped between 2 of her own volumes on the shelf. A slim, battered copy of Keats, the spine worn, the pages soft with handling, carrying the specific quality of a book that has traveled significant distances in someone's coat pocket, set on the corner of the piano without ceremony or note. She read them all. She began leaving things in return, not symmetrically, not as a declared exchange, simply as a natural response to being given things, because she was not the kind of person who received without reciprocating, even when reciprocation was complicated. Annotated passages in the Clementi, where her teaching notes had accumulated into something genuinely interesting. A piece she had transcribed from memory, a melody she had heard once from a Scottish officer's wife at a charity concert and never been able to locate in any collection. And, on one occasion, a single pressed autumn leaf from the garden of the Pemberton house, tucked into the pages of a book he had left, because he had mentioned once, in passing, during a brief exchange in the hallway after a lesson, that autumn in Derbyshire was the only season that had ever felt entirely honest to him. She thought about that sentence for 3 days after she set the leaf down. She thought about the specificity of it, that a man who used words so sparingly had used several of them to describe what a season felt like, that he had said honest, which was not the word most people reached for when describing weather or landscape, that he had said it to her, not into the general air of the conversation, but turned slightly toward her in the particular way he had of directing his words at their intended recipient, as though conversation were a transfer of something valuable that required accuracy of aim. She thought about this while she was not thinking about it. London society noticed, as London society always notices, before either of the parties involved had properly acknowledged the situation to themselves. Mrs. Holt, whose daughter took lessons from Cecily on Wednesday afternoons, mentioned with studied casualness that the Ghost of Sevastopol had been seen twice in the same week walking in the direction of Grosvenor Square at the early morning hour that coincided with Cecily's arrival for lessons. She mentioned it in the particular tone of a woman who is conveying information while maintaining plausible distance from any opinion about it. Lady Pemberton, at whose musicale this had all begun, made a remark at a Thursday dinner about the wisdom of young women in reduced circumstances maintaining the most scrupulous professional propriety in household arrangements. The remark was addressed to the table generally. The table understood it to be addressed to Cecily specifically. Harriet said nothing, but she watched Cecily in the evenings with the bright, patient eyes of a younger sister who knows something is happening and has decided that the most effective strategy is simply to wait until the older one arrives at the inevitable conclusion herself, because arguing would only produce denial. The Major, for his part, gave nothing away to anyone who was not paying close attention. He continued to appear in doorways. He continued to leave books. He spoke to Cecily, in the moments they were unavoidably alone, with the directness she had come to understand was simply how he communicated. Not coldness, not management, just the thing he meant to say, said without decoration. He told her about Crimea in pieces. Not all of it. She understood there were parts of it that did not yet have words, or that had words he was not yet ready to speak aloud, or that had been filed in a place inside him that would require excavation rather than conversation. But pieces. The particular color of the Black Sea from a certain cliff at dawn that he had watched every morning for 6 weeks before the assault and had never been able to describe accurately to anyone. The tent that served as the field hospital where a surgeon worked for 36 consecutive hours while the Major stood outside in the cold doing the thing that comes before prayer when you have been in enough situations to know that prayer is mostly about giving the body somewhere to put the fear while it waits. The sound of his own name in his commanding officer's voice, delivering the order that would send 11 men to positions they could not hold, and the specific quality of the silence that followed, which he had been hearing periodically ever since in the space between sleeping and waking. He told her these things without self-pity, without any of the editorializing that would have made them easier to absorb. In the voice of a man who has made his reports for so long that he reports everything in that voice, including the things that are not, strictly speaking, tactical. She held everything he told her with the care it required. She told him things in return, about her father. Not the version she told at dinner parties, which was brief and contained and closed at both ends, but the actual version, with its specific weight and texture. The morning she had found the estate papers and understood all at once, reading down the column of figures with the number literacy she had developed precisely because no one had expected her to, what the situation was and what she would be required to become. Clara at 11, the same age Annabel was now, standing at the top of the Wiltshire staircase asking when Papa was coming back from London, and the arithmetic Cecily had been doing simultaneously in her head. Which creditors could be held 30 days, which 60, which might be negotiated to something manageable, while she answered Clara's question in a voice she did not recognize as her own. The music lessons she had begun giving that first winter, not only for the income, but because sitting at a piano with someone else's child, listening to them work through something difficult toward something beautiful, was the 1 hour in any week that felt like something rather than the management of something. "You gave up your own playing," he said after a moment. "Not entirely." "Mostly." She looked at her hands in her lap. "There is not much room for playing when you are the one keeping the room heated and the lessons scheduled and the creditors satisfied and the sisters." She stopped. "It's a question of where the hours go." "And where do you go?" he said. Not quite a question. The particular cadence of a man who is asking something more precise than the words on the surface. She met his eyes. "Wherever I'm needed," she said, "which has been for 6 years. Everywhere and nowhere in particular." He was quiet for a moment. "You could play here, in the evenings. The music room is empty after lessons." He looked away, back toward the middle distance he returned to when he had said something that cost him something. "If you wanted." She opened her mouth to decline with the 3 perfectly reasonable sentences she had assembled. "I would like that," she said. She did not examine why for several days. She was becoming less rigorous about certain examinations. She noticed this about herself and could not decide whether it was deterioration or the beginning of something else. It was in the 5th week that the first wall came down. A November storm descended on London with the tactical suddenness of a well-executed ambush. No warning, no gradual escalation, just the full weight of it all at once. The kind of storm that makes the city impassable within the hour and indistinguishable from the sea. Cecily had stayed late helping Annabel work through a passage in the Schubert that had been resisting solution for 2 weeks, and when Stokes appeared in the music room doorway to report the state of the streets outside, it was already clear that going home was not a reasonable proposition. A guest room was prepared. A messenger was sent to the Ashby household. Annabel was carried upstairs asleep over Stokes's shoulder, boneless and unprotesting in the way of exhausted children. "There is supper," the major said in the hallway, "if you'll join me." It was phrased like most of his sentences, with the cadence of a directive rather than an invitation, which she had come to understand was not arrogance but simply the syntax of a man who had spent years in command and had not yet fully retrofitted his language for civilian life. The invitation was genuine. The phrasing was what it was. "Thank you," she said. "I will." Supper was the two of them. The storm outside and the fire in the dining room grate built up to a generosity that filled the room with a warmth that felt, under the circumstances, almost architectural, as though the room itself had decided to make an argument for staying. The major talked more than she had ever heard him talk. Not dramatically, not with the sudden gush of someone who has uncorked something long stopped, simply with the quality of a man who has, for the first time in some while, found himself in a room where he does not need to ration himself. He talked about Annabel, her stubbornness, her brilliance, the way she had looked the first time she heard Cecily play, as though something she had been bracing against had unexpectedly yielded. He talked about Derbyshire, the shape of the moors in winter, the particular cold of them, the way the estate had felt when he returned from Crimea. All of the right dimensions, none of the right feeling. "Hollow," Cecily said. He looked at her. "Yes, exactly that." "I know that feeling. The house in Wiltshire, after my father died. It was the same house, same rooms, same furniture. It smelled the same, and it was entirely different. As though whatever had been making it a home had been a frequency only he could produce, and with him gone, the rooms just became dimensions, square footage." She had not said that to anyone before. The specific quality of it, the frequency, the square footage. She had thought it, alone, in the empty study going over the estate papers, and then she had filed it away in the place where she filed things she did not have time to feel, and she had not taken it out since. He was looking at her with the expression she did not yet have a name for. Not the winter sky assessment, not the professional distance. Something that had come from underneath both of those. "Yes," he said quietly, "exactly that." The fire gave a small sound. The storm pressed against the glass. "The war," she said. She said it simply, without cushioning, because she had come to understand that cushioned questions produced managed answers from him, and she was not, tonight, interested in the managed version. The stillness that moved through him was immediate, the total, practiced stillness of a man who has learned to go very quiet when something is incoming. She watched it happen and waited. "I gave an order," he said finally, "in the last major engagement. I gave an order that I had been commanded to give by a general who had never set foot on the terrain and did not understand what he was commanding. 11 men went to a position they could not hold. 8 of them did not come back." His voice remained level throughout, not the levelness of a man who doesn't feel it, but the levelness of a man who has learned to carry something heavy by distributing its weight across every part of himself so that no single part is visibly breaking. I have given myself the same argument many times, that I was obeying orders, that the fault lay above me, that I could not have. He stopped. The arguments are all technically accurate and entirely beside the point. Because it was your voice that gave the order, Cecily said, not his. He looked at her. Whatever the chain of command, she said quietly, it was your voice that those men heard. And you know that. And no argument changes what you know. She paused. That is not guilt. That is conscience. They are not the same thing, and conflating them has been making it worse. A long silence. The fire. The rain against the windows, indistinguishable now from the dark. No one has said that to me before, he said. No one who said it would have been correct before. You needed enough distance from it first. She looked at her hands. Grief requires distance before it can be examined clearly. The mistake is to examine it too early, before you can see the shape of it, and conclude from the distorted view that the shape is worse than it is. Is that what you did? With your father? I examined it immediately, and concluded catastrophic things about myself that took 2 years to unlearn. She looked up. I would not recommend the approach. He almost smiled. She saw it, the specific quality of almost smile on a face that rarely produced the full version, and felt it somewhere in her sternum with an acuity that she noted and immediately declined to examine. You should do more than teach piano, Miss Ashby, he said. She stood, composed, entirely in command of herself except for the one thing she was not in command of, which she was managing by not looking at directly. I'm going to retire. Good night, Major. Good night, Miss Ashby. She walked out of the dining room with the steadiness she was proud of. She stood in the hallway for 30 seconds before her breathing returned to its customary rhythm. She went to the guest room that Stokes had prepared and lay in the unfamiliar dark with the storm against the windows, and was honest with herself for approximately 12 minutes before she put it away again and went to sleep. After the night of the storm, the thing between them changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that either of them would have named, but perceptibly, the way a landscape perceptibly changes when the season turns. The same elements, different quality of light falling across them. He began to speak to her differently. Not more, he did not suddenly become voluble, did not offer words where none were required, but differently. With the particular directness of a man who has decided, without announcement, to stop filtering. He told her his opinion of the architecture of the Grosvenor Square house, which he considered cold in its proportions and was planning to have altered. He told her about the workers on his Derbyshire estate, one of them by name, a man called Jenkins, who had survived the Crimea under his command and whose pension, Cecily now understood, had been privately supplemented for 3 years. He told her, on a Tuesday in November when the lesson had run long and the light outside had already given up, that he thought she was wasting herself. She had looked at him sharply. Not the teaching, he said. Annabelle is evidence that you are precisely where you should be for her. But, he paused with the specific quality of a man choosing between the thing he means and the thing he can say. You think carefully about things, more carefully than most people think about anything, and then you keep the conclusions to yourself. People in my position are not generally rewarded for their conclusions, she said. I am aware of that, he said. I am also telling you that in this room, with me, the situation is different. She had held his gaze for a moment too long. Then she had looked back at the keys and played the opening of the Schubert without saying anything further. But she held what he'd said the way she held the things he left for her to find, carefully, privately, in the part of herself she had set aside for things that were not practical. That part was getting crowded. She played in the evenings on Wednesdays. The first time she sat at the Broadwood and played Schubert, then Chopin, then, because the room was empty and the house was quiet, and she was alone with an instrument finer than anything she had access to in her own life, and because she was tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with sleep, of disciplining herself. She played the piece she had written herself at 21, during the first winter after her father died, that she had never played for anyone and had never intended to. She did not hear him in the doorway. She finished the piece and, in the silence that followed, became aware, with a cold and certain lurch, that she was not alone. She turned. He was standing in the doorway with an expression that stopped her. Not the assessment, not the managed distance, not even the rare, complicated things she had begun to recognize in moments of genuine feeling. This was something that had come from underneath all of those, something that had been stripped of every layer of professional management and was simply there, undefended. He had been listening for a long time. "That was yours," he said. "It's old. It doesn't—" Cecily. Her name again. The way he said it when he had decided to stop managing something, without the title, with all the weight of a word that has been held in the mouth too long and has finally been put down. "I wrote it after my father died," she said, because the question in his face required an honest answer, and she was not, in this room, in this evening, capable of giving him the managed version. "I had nowhere to put certain things. The piece was where I put them." "You've been extending it," he said. She looked at him. "You've been listening." "On Wednesdays, yes." No apology in it, no performance of apology. Simply the fact, stated plainly, as he stated all facts. "I stand in the hallway. I don't come in, but I listen." A pause. "I hope that's not—" "No," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "It isn't." He crossed the room, not quickly, the way a man moves when he has made a decision he has been resisting for a long time and has finally concluded that the resistance is costing more than the decision. Measured, deliberate. The movement of someone who knows exactly what he is doing and has accepted the weight of it. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the social protocols of their arrangement required her to step backward. She did not step backward. "I know what this is," she said quietly, "and I know what it cannot be. The gap between your situation and mine is not sentiment, it is structural. It has the weight of every convention and expectation in England behind it. And to ignore it would cost you things," he said. "Yes, I know. I have been doing this calculation for 11 weeks, and I am aware of every item on both sides of it." His voice was level, but there was something beneath the levelness, a current running under a frozen surface. "I am also aware that I have not slept well since the night of the storm, that I have been unable to attend to things with the concentration they require because some portion of my attention is permanently occupied with you. What you said last, what you will say next, whether the piece you're teaching Annabelle is something you love or only something that's useful, what you look like when you're deciding whether to say the thing or manage the thing." A pause. "I was trained against distraction. 12 years. I trained myself into a man who could not be distracted from a position under direct fire. And you have completely dismantled that. And I cannot decide whether I'm grateful or furious. And most days, it's both simultaneously." The fire behind her was the only sound. "I cannot be your—" she started. "I am not asking you to be anything," he said. "I am telling you what I am. I am asking you, not ordering, asking, to tell me what you are." His gray eyes on hers, steady and entirely unmanaged. "Not what you've decided it's practical for you to feel. what you are. The silence lasted several seconds that were not like other seconds. Terrified, she said, very quietly. I am completely terrified, because I am a woman with 2 sisters and a house I cannot heat and a name that is held together with 6 years of careful management. And I have spent all of those years keeping the things that don't work locked in a room where I don't have to look at them. She looked up at him. And you are in the room. You have been in the room for 11 weeks, and I cannot make you not be in the room. And I have tried. And I am very good at making things that are inconvenient disappear from my attention. And it is not working. The last of the winter sky distance left his face. He reached out and took her hand from her lap, both of his around one of hers, holding it the way you hold something you have been afraid of dropping, with complete, careful attention. Then we are both in the room, he said. They stood there in the piano room, in the firelight, both entirely aware of everything that stood between them. The rank, the money, the gap, London and its opinions outside the windows, and neither moved toward it, and neither moved away. Then, because she had been disciplined for 27 years and some habits are load-bearing, she said, I need to think. Take what time you need, he said. He released her hand. He stepped back. He did not make it easy, which she respected, because she understood that it was not easy, and pretending otherwise would have been the first dishonesty between them. She went home. She did not sleep until 3 in the morning, and when she did, she dreamed of E-flat major, Sunday, before anyone else wakes up, and woke feeling that something had shifted in her chest, some long-held thing loosening, and lay there in the cold of the Ashby house and allowed herself, for 30 minutes, to want something she had not permitted herself to want. Then she got up and made the household accounts, because the coal merchant was due and the quarterly calculations would not perform themselves. But the 30 minutes had happened, and she did not take them back. She was not, she told herself, going to let it show. This was a reasonable position, and she held it for approximately 4 days. On the first day, she arrived at the lesson and found a note on the piano, not the usual book or annotated passage, but a proper letter, sealed, with her name written on it in his hand. She picked it up, put it down, picked it up again, opened it at the piano bench while Annabelle was retrieving something from upstairs, and read, I have been trying to think of how to say something with sufficient accuracy, and have concluded that my usual approach, saying the thing plainly, is the only approach I have. You said you needed to think. I am not asking you to stop thinking. I am asking you to know, while you think, that what I told you on Wednesday was not a speech. It was not strategy. I have no talent for either. It was simply what is true, and I thought you deserved to know what was true. I will not mention it again unless you want me to. G. She read it twice, folded it with precise, deliberate hands, put it in her coat pocket. She taught the lesson with complete professional composure. She was barely aware of it when her free hand, resting in her lap during Annabelle's independent practice, moved unconsciously to the pocket where the letter was. A small, involuntary checking, like confirming that a valuable thing has not been lost. Annabelle saw it. Annabelle, who saw everything, whose 11-year-old perception operated like a very small, very accurate intelligence service, saw it and said nothing, and played through the Schubert with a small, private expression that she was not quite quick enough to conceal. On the second day, she passed him in the hallway as she was leaving, and he said nothing, true to his word, and she said nothing in return, and the space between them was full of something that did not have a name but had considerable weight. On the third day, she was late. A crisis with Clara's school fees that had required 2 hours and a negotiation she was not proud of, and she arrived at the lesson flustered, coat damp from the rain, pins escaping in 2 places. She came through the music room door already arranging her apology. He was there. Not in the doorway, but in the room itself, standing at the window. And when he turned and saw the state of her, something moved across his face that he did not manage in time. Something that looked like, that had the specific quality of a man who has just seen something he cares about, and the caring is not in his control. He crossed the room and took her wet coat from her shoulders before she had finished forming the sentence. Not dramatically, not as a production, simply with the direct, practical care of a man who has identified something that needs doing and done it. "Thank you," she said, which was not what she meant at all. "The pins," he said, and she became aware that 2 of them were actually falling, and he reached and caught one before it dropped, and this was the problem. This was precisely the problem she had been managing for 11 weeks. His hand was 3 inches from her face when he did it, and he went very still, and she went very still, and they were standing in the music room with her coat in one hand and one of her hairpins in the other, and the distance between them was not the distance of employer and employee. Annabelle arrived in the doorway. "You're here," she announced. "Good, I've been practicing the new part, and I think I've solved the fingering problem." The major stepped back. Cecily straightened. The moment folded itself away. "Show me," Cecily said, and went to the bench and was extremely professional for 45 minutes. But her hand went to her pocket twice during the lesson, and she stopped pretending she didn't know why. The complication arrived, as complications typically do, at the least convenient possible moment. Lady Lavinia Fairborough was 32, widowed from a baron who had left her with an excellent house, an excellent income, and an excellent strategic motivation to remarry well. She was beautiful in the specific, armored way of women who have learned that beauty is a resource and have managed it accordingly. She had identified the major within weeks of his arrival in London, and she had proceeded with the patient, tactical discipline of a woman who has learned that the best positions are not rushed. She called on Grosvenor Square on a Monday morning. Cecily arrived for lessons and was shown through the hall, where Lady Fairborough was descending the drawing-room stairs, unhurried, perfectly composed, carrying herself with the specific ease of a woman who is comfortable in spaces she has decided belong to her. She looked at Cecily with the calm, complete assessment of someone who has just identified a variable she had not previously calculated. "The music instructor," she said pleasantly. "Miss Ashby. I was at school with your elder cousin, I believe, before your family's circumstances shifted." "Lady Fairborough." Cecily's voice was level. "How do you do?" "Very well, thank you. It must be gratifying finding such a comfortable professional arrangement." She descended the last stair with the precision of a woman placing each step exactly where she means to. "Major Ashby is generous with those he employs." "He is fair," Cecily said. "Which is better than generous." Lady Fairborough's smile did not alter. "How refreshingly practical you are." She passed through the hall toward the front door where Stokes was waiting with her coat. "Do give my regards to your sisters." Cecily went upstairs and sat at the piano bench and played a scale, then another, then a third, slightly faster. "You're angry," Annabelle said from beside her. "I'm entirely fine. You're playing like Gideon walks when something's happened that he's choosing not to respond to yet. Very even, very deliberate." Annabelle considered her with the unnerving clarity of the very young and the very perceptive. "She's not a good person, you know, Lady Fairborough. She looks at me the way people look at furniture they're deciding whether to keep or have removed. Cecily said nothing. He doesn't like her, Annabel continued, in the tone of someone presenting evidence. When she visits, he says all the right things because he was trained to be correct in situations he finds disagreeable. But his voice goes flat, like he's reading from a report. She paused. It doesn't go flat when he talks to you. It goes... She stopped, searching for the word. Different. Annabel, I'm only saying what I see. The Schubert, Cecily said. Annabel returned to the Schubert with the expression of someone who has said what they came to say and is content to wait. The Major found Cecily in the hall at the end of the lesson, pulling on her gloves. You saw Lady Fairborough, he said. Briefly. She is someone I have been managing diplomatically since September. I want you to know that clearly. The voice she had learned to distinguish from managed voice, level, direct, not performing anything. There is nothing between us. There will not be. You don't owe me an account of your callers. I owe you honesty, he said. That is different from owing you an account. She worked at the second glove button. She has a great deal to recommend her on purely practical grounds. Cecily, she looked up. I spent 12 years making practical decisions, he said. Every one of them practical, considered, correct on paper. I would like, before I am too old to want things, to make one that isn't. She held his gaze. She was aware of her own heart, which was not behaving with anything like its customary steadiness. She was aware of the hallway, the coat stand, the distance between them, which was approximately the distance at which the social rules of their arrangement began to break down. She finished the glove button. I'll see you Thursday, Major, she said. She walked home in the November afternoon and sat in the Ashby drawing room after her sisters went to bed and did the things she had been refusing to do for 11 weeks. She thought about what she wanted, not what was possible, not what the ledger permitted, what she, Cecily Ashby, who had been managing the wants of other people for 6 years and the disappointment of her own for 6 years before that, actually, specifically, undeniably wanted. It took a long time. She was out of practice. But she got there. The Weatherfield Ball was the event of the November season. 300 guests, a ballroom extended for the occasion into the adjoining gallery, and the particular social pressure that made attendance effectively compulsory for anyone intending to remain part of London life. Cecily attended as companion chaperone to the Hartley family, which was not her preferred position but was a paying one, which was the relevant consideration. She arrived to find the rooms already warm with the specific heat of too many candles and too many opinions, and told herself, as she always told herself at these events, that she would be invisible, efficient, and home by midnight. She saw the Major within 10 minutes. He was across the ballroom in conversation with Colonel Ashworth, positioned near the far wall with the specific posture she had come to read as his social performance mode. Present, correct, generating the minimum viable number of words. He had not seen her. She turned away and managed the Hartley daughters. She was good at this. She chatted with old Mrs. Pendleton, who always needed chatting with and whose hearing made it a relatively uncomplicated task. She intercepted the younger Hartley daughter before she wandered into proximity with a young man of dubious intention. She accepted a glass of wine she did not drink and found a position that was useful and unobtrusive simultaneously. Invisible, efficient, entirely in command of herself. And then the air in the room changed. She turned. He was 2 feet behind her. He had crossed the entire ballroom, she understood, in the time it had taken her to discuss Mrs. Pendleton's niece's unfortunate engagement with a China merchant. Miss Ashby, he said, you are the most deliberate mover in any room you enter. I wasn't aware you were tracking my movements. I've been aware of where you've been standing for the past 35 minutes. stated with complete directness, without embarrassment, in the manner of a man transferring accurate intelligence. You move to positions of maximum utility and minimum visibility. It's tactically coherent. It is also, he paused briefly, unnecessary. Tonight, in this room. She studied him. People will talk. People are already talking. The question is whether we are managing appearances or managing something real. He looked at her with the expression that had come from underneath all the others, unmanaged, entirely present, the one she had been refusing to look at directly for weeks. Dance with me. A beat. Then, please. The please from this man cost something. She heard the cost. The orchestra had begun a waltz at some point in the last 30 seconds, which was the kind of coincidence that Cecily, who did not believe in convenient coincidence, filed under things she was not going to examine right now. She took his hand. He danced with the economy of a man who has learned everything he knows about controlled movement from necessity rather than fashion. Precise, unhurried, carrying exactly the weight of this and nothing extra. And his attention, which she had come to understand was the most valuable thing he possessed, was entirely on her. Not performing, not managing, simply on her. The way it was in the hallway when he caught the hairpin, the way it was in the dining room during the storm. She had not felt like the only person in any room for a very long time. Annabelle played the folk melody perfectly this morning, she said, because she needed to say something that was not the thing she was thinking. I heard her, before breakfast. His hand at her waist was entirely correct. The distance between them was entirely appropriate. She was aware of both with a precision that was entirely disproportionate to the physical facts. She told me you showed her how to say things in music that she can't say out loud. It seemed useful for her specifically. It has been. He looked down at her. They were, the waltz requiring it, close. Not improperly so, but close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes clearly. Not the general impression of them, but the exact color, which was not winter sky at all up close, but something more complicated, something that had other colors in it. She also told me it has been useful for her, watching me when I am watching you. Cecily's breath did something that was not its normal function. What did she mean by that? She meant, he said quietly, that she has concluded from the available evidence that the reason I have been less absent lately is you. And she wanted me to know she approved. His jaw worked briefly with the expression she had learned to read as him deciding between the complete truth and the managed version. He chose the complete truth. He nearly always did, she realized. She is not wrong. The waltz moved them through the turn. Through the windows of the ballroom, Cecily could see the cold dark of the November street outside. London, its carriage lights, its indifferent machinery. In here, warmth, music, his hand at her waist, his eyes on her face. You said you wanted to make one decision that wasn't practical, she said. Yes. I've been thinking about that. I know. I've been watching you think about it for 2 weeks. Not accusation, simply observation. You think very quietly. It looks like composure from the outside. What does it look like from, she started. Like someone who has decided something and is waiting to feel safe enough to say it. He was very steady. Everything about him was steady, in the way of something that has found its footing after a long time of being uncertain where to stand. You don't have to feel safe first. Not with me. The music was coming toward its end. Cecily thought about the pressed leaf in the pages of his book, the note about the reorganized shelf, The letter folded in her coat pocket for 9 days. The hairpin, the E-flat chord, and what it felt like, and who had put words to it. 6 years of managing everything, and the one thing she had not been able to manage because it had gotten into the room before she could lock the door. "I know," she said. "I know I don't." The waltz ended. They stood in the small, particular quiet between the last note and the applause, in the middle of the floor, surrounded by 300 people, entirely alone. She saw over his shoulder Lady Fairborough. She was watching them from across the room with an expression stripped of its social composure, something colder and more calculating underneath it, moving rapidly, recalibrating. Beside her was a man Cecily did not know, older, florid, with the specific physical quality of someone taking up space as an act of will. Something moved in the back of Cecily's mind, a note she couldn't read clearly. She filed it. The major released her hand. The applause completed itself. Around them, the ballroom resumed its patterns. "Afterward," he said quietly, "there is something I need to say tonight. Not in a ballroom. Afterward," she said. She went back to the Hartley daughters. She managed the next hour with the competence she had spent 6 years developing, and was proud of it, and was also completely unable to prevent herself from knowing exactly where he was standing at any given moment, which she was less proud of and had entirely stopped trying to prevent. At 9 o'clock, Cecily slipped out of the ballroom into the gallery adjoining it. She needed air. She needed the particular quality of quiet that exists at the edges of large social events. Not silence, but the reduction of it, the slight lowering of pressure that allows a person to think. She stood at the gallery railing and looked at the room below where London's society circled in its familiar patterns, and allowed herself 2 minutes of thinking about what she was going to say when she found him. She had it by the 90-second mark. She did not hear the footsteps behind her until the hand closed around her arm. She turned. The florid man from earlier, Lady Fairborough's companion, she placed him now. He had been drinking. Not dangerously so, but enough to have uncoupled the part of him that knew better from the part that didn't care. "Sir Gerald Fairborough," he said pleasantly. "Lady Lavinia's brother-in-law, which makes the Major's situation something of a personal matter." His grip on her arm was harder than was appropriate by any social measure. "You've made rather a public display of yourself tonight, Miss Ashby. A woman in your circumstances dancing with the Major in full view of—" "Release my arm," Cecily said. "I'm simply offering counsel. Lavinia would make him an excellent match, an excellent match. And your rather touching campaign has been noted by people who—" "I am a music instructor employed in Major Ashby's household," Cecily said, with a precision she was proud of, given the circumstances. "There is no campaign. Remove your hand." "Or?" He smiled with the specific unpleasantness of a man who has never had to consider consequences in rooms full of people who would side with him. He stepped closer. She stepped back and found the gallery railing. "A woman making accusations against—" The shot came from inside the ballroom. For 1/2 second, Cecily did not understand it as a shot. She understood it as a wrong sound, violently wrong, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in the acoustic register of a ballroom. And then she understood it as chaos, screaming, the crash of something heavy, the surge of 300 people suddenly moving in uncertain directions. Then she understood it as pain. The ricochet was not the shot itself. The shot had been aimed at something else, someone else, and what found her was the fragment. But what finds you does not need to be intended to find you. It caught her upper arm and spun her sideways into the railing, and she was falling. She was falling. And then she wasn't. He caught her before she struck the floor. She knew it was him before she saw his face. She knew it from the particular quality of the arms, the controlled, precise steadiness of a man who has carried people under fire, who knows how to hold something fragile without crushing it, who has been doing the calculation of how to keep people alive for 12 years. She knew it the way you know certain things without looking. She looked anyway. He was on his knees on the gallery floor with her cradled against him, and his face was white. Not the professional composure she had mistaken for coldness when she first met him. Not the managed distance. White. The white of a man whose body has registered something his mind is refusing to accept, who is running every survival protocol available to him because the alternative is to acknowledge what he almost just watched happen. He was pressing his hand against her arm, controlled, experienced. She understood distantly that he had done this before, applied pressure to wounds, calculated blood loss, kept people present with his voice. Cecily. His voice was different. Something had broken open in it that she had never heard before. A register that was not the military voice, not the managed voice, not even the voice from the storm dinner. Something raw. Cecily, look at me. I'm here, she said. I'm looking at you. Don't. He drew a breath that was not steady. She saw his chest move with the effort of steadying it. Dr. Whitmore's coming. He looked at her arm, then at her face. It's not deep. I can see it's not deep. His jaw was rigid. I know that. Then, I need to tell you something. He bent closer, his forehead nearly against hers, and she felt him shaking. Gideon Ashby. The Ghost of Sevastopol. She felt the tremor in his arms, in his hands, through the whole of him. The first time in 12 years, she would learn later, that anyone had seen him shake at anything. I have been trying not to say this for 11 months. I have been building arguments against it. The gap, the rank, what it would cost you, what I don't deserve. And every argument is technically accurate, and I do not care about a single one of them anymore, because I just watched you fall. And for 4 seconds I did not know if I would reach you in time. And those were... He stopped. His voice had fractured. He gathered it. Those were the 4 worst seconds of my life, including the war. The ballroom was chaos behind them. She heard none of it. You're shaking, she said. I know. She looked at him, this man who had rationed his words for 12 years, who had left books on piano benches instead of saying things, who had stood in doorways and listened to her play pieces she'd written for herself, who had caught a hairpin before it fell and gone very still afterward, who had said, you don't have to feel safe first, and understood with the total, unambiguous clarity of a woman who has been honest with herself for 30 minutes in the Ashby drawing room at midnight, that she had been in love with him since the night of the storm. Possibly since the second row of the Pemberton musicale. Possibly since he said, I haven't decided about whether their distant relation was a reassurance or a concern. And she had felt the first tremor of something she had immediately tried to file away. The Ghost of Sevastopol, she said, is shaking. The Ghost of Sevastopol, he said, with the ruins of a voice that was trying and nearly failing to be dry, spent the last 4 minutes believing he was going to watch you fall and arrived too late. His free hand found hers, gripped it, not performed, not managed, simply held with the complete, helpless attention of a man who has run out of the will to manage anything. I love you. I have loved you since the storm. Before the storm, since the second row of the Pemberton musicale when you told me exactly what was wrong with the pianist and were correct about all of it. And I could not think of anyone I had met in 12 years who had been so precisely correct about anything in my presence and made so little effort to perform the correctness for me. He pressed his forehead against hers. Not a social gesture, not a production, simply the act of a man who needs to be close to something and has stopped pretending otherwise. I have been leaving you books because I did not know how to leave you what I actually meant, which was this, which was all of this. Cecily's eyes were filling. She allowed it. She had been allowing things lately that she had previously not permitted, and she was finding that allowing them had not destroyed anything, had in fact been the opposite of destroying. "You reorganized my books," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady either. "The period-based system is objectively superior. You left me a Keats that had been in your coat pocket." "Since Crimea," he said. "Yes." "Gideon," she said, "I love you. I have loved you since the storm and before the storm, and I have been sitting in my drawing room at midnight teaching myself to want things again. And you are the thing I have been teaching myself to want." She looked at him, directly, the way she had finally stopped managing. "I am not a convenient arrangement. I have sisters and a house and a reputation that is, after tonight, considerably more complicated than it was this morning." "I know exactly what you are," he said. "I've known since the storm. I will be a terrible—" "Stop." The remnant of something that was nearly a smile through the white face and the shaking and the blood on his hands from pressing on her wound. "You have been entirely remarkable at every difficult thing you have ever attempted. This is simply the most important, difficult thing. Marriage is not the same as household accounts." "Everything worthwhile," he said with the faintest warmth, "is approached the same way, with honesty, with attention, with the willingness to revise your calculations when the terrain is not what you assumed." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, not performing it, not building it for the audience that was certainly gathering at the gallery entrance by now, simply doing it. "Marry me. Not because of tonight or the scandal or what London will say. Marry me because I have been in the room for 11 months and I have not the slightest intention of leaving it." Behind them, someone, Stokes, she suspected, who had extraordinary instincts for necessary arrivals, said quietly that the doctor was here. Cecily looked at Gideon, at his white face and his gray eyes and his shaking hands that had caught her before she hit the ground, that had caught her from the first moment, really, in every way that mattered, from the second row of the Pemberton Musicale, where he had been deciding something about her and she had been deciding something about him, and neither of them had admitted it until 4 seconds of falling had stripped everything else away. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, plainly, in the voice she used for things she was completely certain of. "Obviously, yes." The scandal was immediate, enormous, and entirely satisfying to London society, which had been waiting for something of this magnitude since at least August. Sir Gerald Fairborough had hired the shooter. This emerged within 24 hours. When Lady Fairborough, presented with the evidence that Colonel Ashworth's people had assembled with military efficiency, and faced with the choice between loyalty to a brother-in-law who had acted without her knowledge and her own freedom, made the pragmatic calculation available to her and told the authorities everything. Sir Gerald had acted on his own initiative, she maintained, and the evidence supported this, and Cecily, who did not particularly wish to see Lady Fairborough destroyed when her actual crime had been ambition rather than attempted murder, said nothing to contradict it. Reginald Thorne, it emerged, had sent Sir Gerald from India with instructions that were several degrees more extreme than anything Lady Fairborough had sanctioned. The original threat had been hers. The escalation had been his. He would not, Colonel Ashworth confirmed, be returning from India. Lady Fairborough left London for her country estate in December and did not return for the remainder of the season. This was generally considered appropriate. The Major, Cecily was finding, with some private amusement that she still called him that in her own mind, that the name Gideon required deliberate deployment, that she was deploying it more and more often, sat beside her in the Grosvenor Square library for the 3 hours it took Dr. Whitmore to assess, clean, and dress the wound, and did not move more than 2 feet from her side throughout. He held her hand for most of it. Not performing this, simply holding it. Afterward, when the doctor had given his assessment, dramatic, not dangerous, the fragment had not penetrated deeply. She would carry a small scar, but nothing worse, and the household had settled around them into the specific quiet of a crisis that has been survived rather than lost. They sat together in the library in the firelight, and he said, "There is one thing I need to be accurate about." She turned to him. "When I said I didn't deserve you," he said, "I was being accurate, not self-deprecating. I am a man with nightmares and an estate in Derbyshire and 11 dead men in the accounting of my conscience. I am not easy to know, and I have not, historically, tried to be. I will make mistakes that I will be slow to name because I have spent 12 years not naming things. I will stand in doorways when I should come into rooms." A pause. "I am telling you this so that when it happens, you will know it is not a withdrawal of what I said tonight. It is simply the man I am, working on it." Cecily looked at him for a long moment. "I have spent 6 years making things look effortless that are not," she said. "I will sometimes make you feel that you are an item on a list of things I am managing, and I will not mean it that way. But I will do it. I keep everything I feel in a very organized interior filing system that I have been slowly dismantling, and I will occasionally retrieve things from it that should have been dealt with at the time but weren't." She paused. "I am telling you the same thing." He was quiet. "We are," he said, "going to be very honest with each other." "We already are," she said. "We've been honest with each other since the 2nd row of the Pemberton Musicale. It's the only mode either of us has." He looked at her, and then, fully, completely, without management or distance or the remnants of 12 years of practiced control, he smiled. The real one. The one she had caught the edges of before, but never the whole of. It transformed his face. It made him look younger and warmer, and like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had just, in this room, in this firelight, on this particular November night, put it down. "Annabelle is going to be insufferable about this," he said. "Annabelle," Cecily said, "has been insufferable about it for 6 weeks. She has simply been waiting for us to catch up." The Grosvenor Square music room had accumulated, over the course of a year and 8 months, the specific warm disorder of a room that is genuinely lived in rather than maintained. There were Annabelle's drawings on the wall, horses mostly, since she had recently developed the conviction that she would eventually own one, a conviction that Cecily suspected would be rewarded by Gideon at the first available opportunity because he was, beneath 12 years of military self-containment, entirely unable to refuse Annabelle anything she argued for with sufficient persistence. There was a second piano bench cushion, chosen by Annabelle from a market stall, which clashed spectacularly with the room's existing palette, and which neither adult had suggested removing because they had both seen her face when she placed it there. There were fresh roses from the garden, Stokes's weekly judgment, this week the dark red ones from the north wall, which he had correctly identified as the best of the season. On the piano, the worn Keats. Between its pages, dried flowers from the garden of the Derbyshire estate, where they had been married in the private chapel 6 weeks after the ball, with Colonel Ashworth giving her away and Annabel standing as witness with an expression of concentrated satisfaction, and Stokes weeping silently in the second pew, and Dr. Whitmore attending to ensure his patient did not overexert himself and ruining the effect somewhat by being correct. Cecily was playing. Not teaching, playing. The piece she had written at 21 and extended at 27 and had since extended further, acquiring new sections the way certain things acquire layers over time. Through accumulation, through the gradual addition of what keeps happening. Beside her on the bench, his shoulder against hers, sat Gideon. He could not play. He had attempted it exactly once under Annabel's instruction, producing sounds that had caused Stokes to briefly leave the room. He had accepted the verdict on his musicianship with more equanimity than he had accepted most criticisms in his life, and had since developed his own relationship with the piano room. He sat in it. In the evenings, beside her, in the manner of a man who has identified the place in his house that is most fully home and has decided to be present in it as often as possible. He had nightmares, still, sometimes, less often. She woke when he did and did not always speak. Sometimes the room was enough, the warmth of it, the presence of another person who was not startled by the difficulty of it. He had learned, slowly, imperfectly, with the consistent effort of a man who has decided that improvement matters more than competence, to come into rooms rather than stand in their doorways. She had learned, slowly, imperfectly, to leave things in her filing system long enough to feel them before organizing them into usefulness. They were, between them, a work in progress. They had decided this was a satisfactory arrangement. Harriet had married her Bristol solicitor in the spring, a man named Charles who had the steadiness of someone who had worked hard for everything he had and the sense of humor of someone who had found it necessary, and who looked at Harriet with the specific expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and intends to deserve it. The wedding had been small and warm, and Harriet had cried throughout in the happy way, and Cecily had sat in the front pew with Gideon's hand in hers and felt, for the first time in years, that all the accounting was coming out correctly. Clara was in Wiltshire, working with horses and apparently thriving. She had written last week to report that she had stopped being frightened of drawing rooms, which she had decided were simply stables for people, and that this framing had been extremely helpful. Annabel was 13 now and had opinions about everything, and had decided she was going to study natural sciences, which everyone found alarming, and Cecily found entirely reasonable, and Gideon had responded to by finding the best natural sciences tutor in London and saying nothing about it to anyone. The Greystone Scholarship, named for Annabel, endowed by Gideon, administrated with characteristic efficiency by Cecily, had placed 11 girls this year in institutions that would not previously have considered them. Annabel checked the list of recipients every quarter and wrote letters to each of them, which was her own addition to the arrangement and which Cecily had said nothing about because some things should simply be allowed to grow the way they grow. London society had adjusted. Not completely. There would always be whispers, always be people who looked at Cecily and saw the music instructor rather than the woman, always be those who thought the Duke of Greystone had made a peculiar choice and said so in drawing rooms that Cecily had long since stopped attending. She did not particularly mind. She had spent 6 years being invisible and had found that being talked about was, on the whole, preferable. Gideon had gone still beside her. She knew the quality of his stillness now, the full range of it. She knew the stillness of a man listening for something in the distance, and the stillness of a man at rest, and the stillness of a man sitting in a room where he is entirely at home in a way he has not been at home anywhere for a very long time. This was the last kind. She reached the new section of the piece, the part she had added in the months after the wedding, which sounded different from the earlier sections because it was different, because the person who had written the earlier parts had been alone in a cold room in Wiltshire, placing grief somewhere it would keep, and the person writing the new parts was here, in this warm room, with roses on the piano and someone's shoulder against hers. She played it through to its new ending. The last note held. In its resonance from upstairs came the sound of Annabelle's footsteps. She was back early from her lesson, which meant either something excellent or something catastrophic had occurred. And in either case, she would need to tell them about it immediately and at length, because she was 13 and in possession of strong opinions, and there was nothing wrong with that. There was, in fact, everything right with it, and Cecily intended to make sure she always knew it. "She's back early," Gideon said. "She'll have something to tell us." "She always has something to tell us." "Yes." A pause. The last resonance of the note fading. "Play the new part again," he said. She looked at him, at this man who had arrived in her life in pieces, in November, and borrowed books and a hairpin caught before it fell, who had put down 12 years of weight in a gallery on a November night and picked up something else in its place, who had learned to come into rooms and was working consistently and without complaint on the rest of it. He was looking at the piano, at her hands on the keys, at the roses and the worn Keats and the clashing bench cushion that he had never once suggested removing. She thought about the ledger, the household accounts, the coal merchant, the borrowed gloves and the needed boots, and the 6 years of making things work with insufficient materials. She thought about the Pemberton Musicale, the second row, the pianist rushing through the bar, 19-fingering difficulty rather than solving it. She thought about the storm and the dining room and the specific gray of his eyes at close range that was not winter sky at all, but something more complicated. She thought about the piece she had written at 21 for herself alone and had played for him before she meant to and had been understood. She played the new part. Annabelle came in and sat on the bench and leaned against her and said, immediately and without preamble, that her natural sciences tutor had told her that women could not be naturalists, which she had told him was incorrect on the evidence, and had he met her family, and she would like to discuss it. Gideon met Cecily's eyes over Annabelle's head. The music room was warm. The roses were the good ones. Outside, the November dark was pressing at the windows the way it always did this time of year, the way it had been pressing at the windows the night of the storm, the night that everything had begun to become what it was now. Inside, this, the three of them, the firelight, the piano still resonant. "Tell us," Cecily said to Annabelle, "all of it." And she did.